Eleanor Whitmore pressed her back against the cold wall of her father's study, her wedding veil still pinned to her hair, and listened to the man she loved sell her future to her own sister. She did not scream. She did not run. She stood there trembling and silent and memorized every word. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow Eleanor's story all the way to the end. You will not want to miss what she does next. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Eleanor Whitmore was supposed to become a wife, she woke before the sun. She lay still in the dark of her childhood bedroom, listening to the house breathe around her. The maids were already moving through the hallways below. She could hear them, the soft shuffling of slippered feet, the clink of water pitchers, the hushed voices that carried the particular excitement of a household preparing for a wedding. In a few hours, every respectable family in Charleston would be seated beneath the white oak trees that lined the Whitmore estate, watching Eleanor walk toward the man who had promised to love her until the earth gave way beneath his feet. She had believed him. That was the part that would ache longest, she would think later. Not the betrayal itself, but the believing. Eleanor Rose Whitmore was 24 years old, the only daughter of the late Edmund Whitmore, shipping merchant landowner and the most trusted man on the Carolina coast. Her father had died 18 months ago, quietly in the chair by the window, where he always read his morning correspondence. He had left Eleanor everything: the house, the land, the fleet of 3 coastal trading vessels, the contracts with the tobacco growers up and down the Waccamaw River. An inheritance that made her, in the eyes of every ambitious man in Charleston, the most valuable unmarried woman in South Carolina. Eleanor had never thought of herself that way. She had thought of herself as her father's daughter, as a woman who could read a ledger before she could properly hem a dress, as someone who loved the smell of river water and the particular satisfaction of a trade-completed fare. She had thought of herself until 8 months ago as a woman who might never find a man who interested her enough to marry. And then, Nathaniel Ashford had walked into the shipping office on a Thursday afternoon in October, removed his hat when he saw her at the desk, and asked her a question about the tidal schedules on the Cooper River that told her immediately he was not pretending to know less than he did in order to flatter her. She had liked him for that first. She sat up in bed now and pressed her hands flat against her knees. The room was warm already. It was July 1817. And the South Carolina summer had settled over Charleston like a wool blanket left too long in the sun. Her wedding dress hung on the doorframe across the room, ivory silk and cream lace, a thing of considerable beauty that her mother's seamstress had spent 6 weeks producing. She had tried it on 4 times, and each time the seamstress had wept a little, which Eleanor had found both touching and slightly alarming. She rose, washed her face, and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of what she privately called the indulgence, the allowance of pure, uncomplicated happiness. She thought about Nathaniel's hands, the way he laughed at his own mistakes before anyone else could. The evening 3 months ago, when he had walked with her along the Battery and told her without sentiment or performance that he had never met a woman whose mind he respected more than hers. 3 minutes. Then she dressed herself and went downstairs to manage the chaos of her own wedding day. The Whitmore house on that morning was a respectable madness. The household staff, 6 of them, all of whom had served the family for over a decade, had been up since 4 in the morning, arranging chairs, pressing linens, overseeing the delivery of flowers from 3 different gardens. Thomas Bennett, who had been the Whitmore family steward for 31 years, and who had known Eleanor since she was 4 years old, and already making trouble in the ledger room, stood in the center of the entrance hall, with a list in his hand, and the expression of a man conducting a military campaign. "The ice," he said when he saw Eleanor come down the stairs, "has not arrived." "Then send James for it," Eleanor said, moving past him toward the kitchen. "And good morning, Thomas." "Good morning, Miss Whitmore." He fell into step beside her. "The flowers are placed. The chairs are arranged. Reverend Caldwell arrived an hour ago and is currently consuming a remarkable quantity of our coffee. Let him. He'll need the fortitude. Your sister has not come down yet." Eleanor paused at the kitchen door. "Caroline never comes down before 9. It is now 8:15. Given the circumstances, I had hoped. She'll come down when she's ready, Thomas. Leave her be." She said it without sharpness. without any particular feeling at all, which was itself a kind of practiced art. Eleanor had spent 24 years learning how to manage Caroline, who was 3 years younger and had always lived at a slight angle to the rest of the world, too sensitive for criticism, too stubborn for guidance, too hungry for something that Eleanor had never quite been able to name or provide. She had loved her sister anyway, completely and without condition, the way their father had taught her to love the things that were difficult. She went into the kitchen and began checking the arrangements for the wedding breakfast. Nathaniel Ashford arrived at the house at 9:30. Eleanor heard his voice in the entrance hall from the top of the stairs, where she had retreated to have her hair dressed by the maid. His voice was one of the things she loved about him, low and even with a Virginia accent that turned certain vowels into something almost musical. She heard him exchange pleasantries with Thomas. She heard Thomas's responses, which were correct and professional, which was the only way Thomas ever responded to anyone. She finished with her hair and went to the window. The grounds below were already filling. Carriages lined the drive. Guests in their summer finery moved across the lawn toward the rows of white chairs arranged beneath the oaks. She recognized faces Judge Hartwell and his wife, the Beaumont family, from upriver the Hargrove brothers, who controlled the cotton trade in 3 counties. Her father's friends. Her father's associates. Men who had watched her grow up in that shipping office and who would watch her today become a wife. She pressed her hand flat against the window glass and thought, "This is the last morning of the life I know." She meant it as a hopeful thing. She was dressed and pinned and veiled by 11:15. The ceremony was set for noon. Eleanor had perhaps 70 minutes, and she chose to spend 15 of them alone in her father's study, which was her custom whenever she needed to think clearly. The study was the one room in the house that had not been rearranged for the wedding. Thomas had offered to clear it for use as a dressing room, and she had said no. She needed one room that was still his. She walked down the hall, her wedding dress whispering against the floorboards, and put her hand on the study door. It was not fully closed. She heard voices before she touched the handle. The first voice was Nathaniel's. The second voice stopped her hand entirely. It was Caroline. Eleanor stood very still. She was not, in her own assessment, a woman given to eavesdropping. She believed in directness the way her father had believed in it, as both a moral principle and a practical efficiency. But something in the particular quality of the silence between words, the hushed, deliberate intimacy of 2 people speaking in a closed room, they believed was private, held her exactly where she stood. "The land deeds," Nathaniel was saying. "Bennett keeps them in the iron box in the lower drawer. After today they'll need to be transferred into my name. It's standard for a husband to manage. She won't sign them over easily." Caroline's voice was low, careful, the voice of someone who had thought about this. "Eleanor knows every piece of that property. She'll ask questions. She'll trust me by then. That's the entire point of the ceremony, Caroline." A pause. "And the shipping contracts?" Caroline asked. "Those transfer upon marriage as well. The Beaumont connection, the river routes, all of it. The Whitmore name becomes an asset I control, not one I inherit by affection." Eleanor's hand was still flat against the wall beside the door. She noticed with a distant and almost academic interest that she was not breathing. "You said we would leave Charleston," Caroline said. "You said once the estate was secured." "I said a great many things." Nathaniel's voice had shifted slightly. Not unkind, simply honest in the way that men were honest when they believed no one who mattered was listening. "The point is that Eleanor will believe everything that happens because she trusts me. And she trusts me because I made certain she would." Another pause. Longer. "She loves you," Caroline said. There was something in her sister's voice that Eleanor could not immediately name. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that recognized the weight of what was being said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "She does. That's what makes this efficient." Eleanor pressed her back against the wall beside the door and closed her eyes. She stood there for a long time. Not crying, not shaking, not doing anything at all that could be heard. Her father's voice came back to her clear as it had always been from a morning 15 years ago when she was 9 years old and had lost an argument badly and wept about it. "Eleanor, the person who loses control first loses the battle. You hear me? First you understand what happened. Then you decide what to do about it. Never the other way around. She understood what had happened. Now she needed to decide what to do about it. She pushed herself off the wall, straightened her spine inside the wedding dress, and walked back down the hall toward the front of the house. Thomas Bennett was in the entrance hall when she came back down. He looked up from his list, and something in his expression shifted. Not alarm exactly, but a particular sharpening of attention. The look of a man who had known a woman since she was 4 years old, and could read the difference between her ordinary face and the face she showed when she had made a decision. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully. "Thomas." She kept her voice even conversational, the voice she used when she was doing figures in the ledger and needed to concentrate. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me plainly." "Of course." "The iron box in the lower drawer of Father's desk. What does it contain?" Thomas was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "The land deeds," he said. "The original property surveys for the estate and the river parcels. The deeds of ownership for the 3 vessels. The primary contracts with the tobacco growers. Who else knows where they're kept?" Another pause. Longer. "Mr. Ashford asked me about the filing system," Thomas said slowly. "Approximately 3 weeks after your engagement was announced. He said he wanted to familiarize himself with the estate management. I showed him the office. I did not open the box, but I indicated which drawer it was in." Eleanor held Thomas's gaze. "And you said nothing to me?" It was not an accusation. It was a question, and he understood the difference. "I should have," Thomas said. He said it quietly, without defense. "I told myself it was ordinary prudence for a man about to manage a property of this size. He stopped. "I was wrong to assume, Miss Whitmore. I am sorry." She looked at him for a moment. "How long have you served this family, Thomas?" 31 years. "And in 31 years has my father ever had cause to doubt your judgment about what was ordinary and what was not?" "No, ma'am." "Then I'm going to ask you to use that judgment now." She stepped closer to him and lowered her voice. "I need 3 things. I need the iron box brought to me before the ceremony begins. I need you to locate Judge Hartwell and ask him quietly and without explanation to stay close to the east side of the hall during the ceremony. And I need you to find the letters." Thomas went very still. "Which letters, Miss Whitmore?" "You know which ones." He held her gaze for a long moment. His face changed something she had no name for, some interior reckoning she couldn't fully read. Then he said quietly, "Your father gave them to me. For safekeeping. He said—" He stopped. Started again. "He said he hoped you would never need them. That if the right man came along they could be burned. They weren't burned." "No, ma'am." Thomas squared his shoulders. "They were not." "Then bring them to me." "Yes, Miss Whitmore." She turned to go and then stopped. "One more thing. Caroline, where is she now?" "In her room, I believe. She came down briefly about an hour ago and then went back upstairs." Eleanor nodded. "Don't tell her anything. Don't tell anyone anything. Can you do that?" "Miss Whitmore," Thomas said with the quiet dignity of a man who had served one family for 31 years and understood exactly what loyalty meant, "I have been keeping this family's business private since before you were born." She almost smiled. "Good. Then let's get through a wedding." What happened in the next 40 minutes happened quietly, quickly, and entirely below the awareness of the 200 guests who were settling into their chairs beneath the white oak trees and fanning themselves against the July heat. Thomas brought her the iron box. She opened it, verified the contents. Deeds, surveys, contracts, all present and correct, and locked it again with the key that had been on her father's watch chain and was now on hers. Thomas brought her the letters. There were 11 of them, written in a hand she did not recognize until she looked at the name signed at the bottom of the 3rd one, and then she recognized it very well. She read 4 of them, standing at her father's desk in the study, which was empty now, Nathaniel and Caroline both gone. The room holding only the smell of old paper and her father's pipe tobacco. She read them carefully, the way her father had taught her to read any document that would be used in a negotiation, not for feeling, but for fact. Then she put them in the silk pocket of her wedding dress, which the seamstress had added at Eleanor's specific insistence over the seamstress's very vocal objections, and she went to find Judge Hartwell. Nathaniel Ashford, in the meantime, was being magnificent. Eleanor observed this from a distance through the window of the upstairs hallway, watching him work the crowd below with the ease of a man who had been charming people his entire life. He was handsome, she would always acknowledge, that tall, broad-shouldered with dark hair, and the kind of deliberate, attentive manners that made every person he spoke to feel briefly like the most important person in the room. He shook hands with Judge Hartwell. He laughed with the Beaumont brothers. He accepted the congratulations of 3 Charleston merchants with the appropriate mixture of pleasure and humility. Howe was very, very good at this. She had known that. She had admired it. She wondered now how much of what she had admired had been performance, and how much, if any of it, had been real. It didn't matter. Not for what came next. She went downstairs. Caroline was in the east parlor, sitting at the edge of a chair, with her hands folded in her lap, wearing a pale blue dress and the expression of a woman waiting for something she both wanted and dreaded. She looked up when Eleanor entered, and something flickered across her face. Guilt, or something close to it, or something close to something close to it. Eleanor sat down across from her. They looked at each other. "You look beautiful," Caroline said. "I heard you," Eleanor said. "In Father's study. I heard both of you." The color went out of Caroline's face completely. She opened her mouth and closed it again without producing a sound. Her hands tightened in her lap. "I'm not going to ask you why," Eleanor said. "Not yet. I don't have time for that conversation right now, and honestly, Caroline, I'm not certain I want to have it at all today." She kept her voice level. Not cold. Exhausted, maybe. The particular exhaustion of a woman who has been betrayed by someone she loved and is choosing consciously and deliberately not to fall apart about it yet. "I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer me honestly, because I think you still know what honesty is, even if you've forgotten to use it." Caroline's chin wobbled. "Eleanor, did he ever intend to marry you, or were you only useful to him while I was—" The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then Caroline's face crumpled. Not dramatically, she didn't collapse or cry out. Just crumpled quietly the way a paper letter crumples when it gets wet. She pressed her hand over her mouth and closed her eyes, and a single tear went down her face, and Eleanor watched it and felt the weight of 21 years of sisterhood pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. "No," Caroline whispered. "He never intended to marry me." "When did you know?" "3 weeks ago." Her voice was barely audible. "I found a letter. He had been writing to someone else. A woman in Savannah. He intends to go there once the estate is secured." Eleanor breathed in slowly, breathed out. "So you are as much a fool as I am." "I am worse than you," Caroline said. "Because I knew something was wrong. I told myself it wasn't. I told myself—" She stopped. "You told yourself what you wanted was worth what you were doing." Caroline nodded. Her shoulders were shaking. Eleanor stood up. She straightened the skirt of her wedding dress. She looked at her sister for a long moment, at the familiar shape of her face, the curve of her jaw that was their father's jaw, the eyes that were the same gray as Eleanor's own. "When this is over," Eleanor said, "we are going to have a very long conversation, and I'm going to be angry, Caroline. I want you to know that. I'm going to be very, very angry." She paused. "But you are still my sister, and I am not going to let you be destroyed by a man who used you as a convenience any more than I intend to let him destroy me." Caroline looked up. "Eleanor, what are you going to do?" Eleanor smoothed the front of her veil. "Attend my wedding," she said. "Now go fix your face. I need you in that hall, and I need you composed." She walked out. The ceremony began at noon precise to the minute. 200 people rose to their feet when Eleanor appeared at the far end of the aisle. She heard the collective intake of breath that a crowd makes when it is genuinely moved, and she thought with a part of her mind that was maintaining a running commentary on everything that was happening, that it was a shame. It was a genuine shame that this dress and this morning and this moment could not be what they were supposed to be. The seamstress had worked 6 weeks on this dress, and Eleanor had done nothing wrong, and it was a shame. She walked down the aisle. She looked at Nathaniel standing at the front with Reverend Caldwell. He was smiling. It was a beautiful smile. There was nothing in it as far as Eleanor could see that revealed anything at all. No unease, no guilt, no awareness. That the woman walking toward him had spent the last 40 minutes reorganizing the ground beneath his feet. He held out his hand when she reached him. She took it. His hand was warm and dry and steady, and she thought, he is very good at this. Reverend Caldwell began to speak. The familiar words, the words she had heard at a dozen weddings over the years, the words she had imagined on quiet evenings being spoken over herself one day. She listened to them carefully and found she could hold them in her mind simultaneously with everything else that was in her mind, which she took as evidence that her father's training had held, even through the worst morning of her adult life. Nathaniel spoke his vows. He looked at her while he spoke them. He held her hand while he spoke them. His voice was even and warm and entirely convincing. And she thought about the letters in the pocket of her wedding dress, and thought about her father, and thought about 31 years of Thomas Bennett keeping a family's business private. Then it was her turn. Reverend Caldwell looked at her gentle and expectant. Eleanor looked out at the 200 people in their chairs, the judges and the merchants and the cotton men and the river families and the neighbors and the friends and the people who had known her father and who believed they had come today to see a happy occasion. She took a slow breath. "Before I speak my vows," she said loudly enough that the words carried to the back of the gathering, "I believe there is something that every person here deserves to hear." She felt Nathaniel's hand tighten on hers. She felt rather than saw the ripple that went through the crowd. The shift in posture, the sudden attention, the particular quality of silence that falls when 200 people simultaneously understand that something unexpected is happening. "I have spent 8 months believing that Nathaniel Ashford loved me," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. She had her father's voice when it mattered, low, clear, unhurried. "I have spent 8 months believing that what he wanted was a life built with me, a partnership, a family. I brought him into my father's house. I introduced him to my father's friends. I showed him the books and the maps and the contracts because I believed—" She stopped for exactly one breath. "Because I believed he was the kind of man my father would have respected," Nathaniel said quietly and very controlled. "Eleanor." His hand tightened again. She stepped back gently and firmly, and his hand fell away. "3 hours ago," she said, "standing outside my father's study, I heard Nathaniel Ashford describe his intentions for this marriage to my sister." She paused. His intentions were not love. They were not partnership. They were the acquisition of this estate, these lands, these shipping contracts, and the removal of my name from the management of everything my father spent his life building. The silence was absolute. Nathaniel's face had changed. Not dramatically, he was too controlled for that. But something had shifted beneath the surface, some calculation running very fast behind his eyes. "That is a serious accusation," he said. His voice was still even, still warm, still the voice of a man who had been charming people his entire life. "And I believe it is coming from a woman who is frightened." "Thomas," Eleanor said. Thomas Bennett stepped forward from the side of the gathering. He was holding a bundle of papers. "These," Eleanor said, "are letters written by Nathaniel Ashford to his associate in Savannah, detailing his plans for the Whitmore estate, following what he anticipated would be a prompt and cooperative marriage." She looked at Judge Hartwell, who was standing exactly where she had asked him to stand. "Judge Hartwell, I believe you are familiar with property law in this state." Hartwell looked at the papers Thomas was holding, and then looked at Nathaniel, and then looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man who was recalibrating his understanding of the morning very rapidly. "I am," he said. "Then I would ask you to review these letters and confirm to this gathering whether the actions described within them would constitute fraud against the estate of a deceased landowner." Nathaniel moved. Not toward Eleanor, toward Thomas. One step, and then he stopped because he had looked at the 200 faces around him and performed very quickly the calculation that a man like him always performed and understood that the moment for action had passed. Judge Hartwell crossed the aisle and took the letters from Thomas. He read the first one. then the second. The crowd held its breath. "Good Lord," Judge Hartwell said quietly to no one in particular. And then louder, with the careful, measured weight of a man of the law. "These letters do indicate a premeditated plan to acquire the Whitmore property through fraudulent misrepresentation within a marriage contract. That is yes. That would constitute fraud." The sound that went through the crowd was not dramatic. It was not shouting or gasping or the noise of a theatrical audience. It was the sound of 200 people who were almost every single one of them connected to the property and trade and legal structures of Charleston, South Carolina, and who understood immediately and completely what had almost happened and why it mattered. Nathaniel turned to Eleanor. His face had gone very controlled too. Controlled, the kind of control that was one layer above panic. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was lower now. "Listen to me. Whatever you think you heard, I heard you say," Eleanor replied calmly, "that I would believe everything that happened because I trusted you, and that my trust was what made it efficient." She held his gaze. "I did trust you, Nathaniel. I want you to understand that. I trusted you completely, and I am going to ask you to understand something in return." She reached into the pocket of her wedding dress and removed the key to the iron box. "This estate," she said, "belonged to my father. It belongs to me. It will belong one day to my children if I choose to have them, and with a man I choose for reasons that are my own." She put the key back in her pocket. "You are not that man. You were never going to be that man. But you spent 8 months trying to make me believe otherwise, and for that—" She paused. One breath. "For that, I think you owe 200 people an apology." Nathaniel stared at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat from the chair beside the altar. He walked down the aisle. He did not look back. The sound that came from the gathering as he passed, not jeering, not shouting, just 200 people turning to watch a man walk out of a property he had tried to steal, was the quietest, most comprehensive thing Eleanor had ever heard. She stood at the front of the gathering in her father's handmade lawn with 200 people watching her, and she took a slow breath, and she thought about her father sitting in his chair by the window, reading his morning correspondence in the last years of his life. She thought he would have been proud of her. Not because she had caught the man, not because she had planned carefully and held her nerve and assembled the evidence in 40 minutes while wearing a wedding dress, but because she had stood in front of 200 people and spoken the truth plainly. First you understand what happened," he had said. "Then you decide what to do about it." She had understood. She had decided. The rest, the legal proceedings, the canceled contracts, the conversation with Caroline that would take the better part of a week and leave them both exhausted, the rest would come. But the worst of the morning was over. Eleanor Whitmore smoothed the front of her veil, turned to face the 200 people who were still watching her in silence, and said in the same clear, carrying voice her father had given her, "I believe the wedding breakfast is still warm, and I believe every one of you has traveled a long way this morning." She paused. "My family is grateful for your witness today, even if it was not quite the kind of witnessing any of us anticipated." And slowly, like a room learning to breathe again, the gathering began to murmur, and then to move, and then, in the particular way of people who have been through something they will be talking about for the rest of their lives, to find their way toward the tables and the food and the complicated necessary business of deciding what had just happened and what it meant. Thomas Bennett appeared at Eleanor's elbow. "The ice arrived," he said. Eleanor almost laughed. "Of course it did. What would you like me to do?" "Miss Whitmore." She considered. She looked at the grounds of her father's estate, the trees he had planted, the drive he had laid, the house he had built before she was born. She looked at the people moving across the lawn, people who had come today as witnesses and who would leave as something else entirely. "Pour the lemonade," she said. "Keep the coffee hot, and Thomas." She looked at him. "Thank you." Thomas Bennett, who had served the Whitmore family for 31 years, and who had kept their business private through death and grief, and one near-catastrophic wedding, gave a small, precise nod. "It has been," he said with quiet sincerity, "my honor, Miss Whitmore." Eleanor squared her shoulders and walked into the rest of her life. The wedding breakfast had been going for less than 20 minutes when Eleanor felt the first wave of exhaustion hit her. Not emotional exhaustion. Not grief. The specific bone-deep fatigue of a woman who had held herself together by pure will for 3 hours and was now standing in the middle of her own lawn, holding a glass of lemonade she hadn't touched. Watching 200 people eat her food and talk about what they had just witnessed. She could hear fragments of conversation drifting past her names. Speculations, the particular hushed energy of people processing a shared scandal, and she let them drift the way you let river water move past you when you're standing still in the current. Thomas was managing the staff with his usual quiet efficiency. The tables were full. The coffee was hot. The ice, having finally arrived, was performing its function in the lemonade pitchers without drama, which Eleanor considered a personal victory. She was thinking about what came next when Margaret Beaumont appeared at her elbow. Margaret Beaumont was 62 years old, had buried 2 husbands and outlasted both of their families, and was generally considered the most reliable source of honest opinion in 3 counties. She put her hand on Eleanor's arm without preamble and said, "Your father would have been proud of you this morning." Eleanor looked at her. "You think so? Edmund Whitmore raised you to protect what was his. You did that." Margaret squeezed her arms and released it. "Now stop standing here looking like you're waiting for permission to breathe. You won. Act like it." Eleanor almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost laugh arriving from somewhere below the exhaustion. "Mrs. Beaumont," she said, "I don't know that I've won anything yet." "You kept your name on your own land," Margaret said flatly. "For a woman in 1817, that is winning. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She moved away toward the refreshment tables, pausing only to add over her shoulder, "And eat something. You look like a woman who forgot breakfast." Eleanor had in fact forgotten breakfast. She set down the lemonade and went to find something to eat, and it was while she was standing at the far end of the second table, mechanically consuming a piece of cornbread, that Judge Hartwell found her. How was a careful man? Hartwell measured in the way that men who spent their lives adjudicating disputes between other men tended to become measured. He moved with deliberation. He spoke with precision. He had been her father's friend for 20 years, and Eleanor trusted him in the specific way she trusted a well-maintained piece of machinery reliably within its proper function. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I wonder if I might have a private word." She nodded and followed him away from the tables to the far side of the oak nearest the house, where they could speak without being overheard by the Hargrove brothers, who were standing close enough to be conspicuous about it. "The letters," Hartwell said without preamble. "Have you had time to read all of them?" "4 of them." "Then you haven't read the 7th. He paused. "I think you need to." She looked at him. "What's in the 7th? "A name," Hartwell said. "A name that will complicate this considerably." Eleanor set down the cornbread. "Whose name?" Hartwell was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man who was choosing his next words with the same care he would choose his footing on unstable ground. "I would rather you read it yourself," he said. "Some things need to be understood in a woman's own mind before they're explained to her by someone else." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the letters, all 11 of them still bundled, and held them out to her. She took them. "There are also," Hartwell said, "2 members of this gathering who have asked me in the last 20 minutes whether charges will be brought." "Will they?" "That depends," he said carefully, "on what you want to do. Fraud of this nature, the premeditated misrepresentation within a marriage contract with intent to acquire property, is actionable. The letters are evidence. Ashford's departure this morning before any of this could be formally addressed is not," he paused, "not helpful to his position." "I see." She held the letters in both hands. "And if I choose not to pursue formal charges?" Hartwell looked at her steadily. "Then Nathaniel Ashford walks away from this morning with his reputation damaged and his plan failed, but without legal consequence. He finds another situation. He uses the same approach on another woman who doesn't have a Thomas Bennett or a father who taught her to read a room." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm not telling you what to decide, Miss Whitmore. I am telling you what the options produce." Eleanor nodded. "Give me an hour." "Of course." She walked toward the house. She read the seventh letter in her father's study, sitting in his chair with the door closed and the noise of the wedding breakfast muffled on the other side of the wall. The letter was dated 6 weeks before Nathaniel had first walked into the Whitmore shipping office. It was written to a man named Cyrus Whitmore, her father's brother, her uncle. A man she had met perhaps 4 times in her life, who lived in Virginia and who had contested her father's will 18 months ago and lost, and who had, according to every account Eleanor had ever heard, accepted that loss and moved on. According to the 7th letter, he had not moved on. According to the 7th letter, Cyrus Whitmore had approached Nathaniel Ashford 7 months before Eleanor had ever laid eyes on him with a proposal. Nathaniel would court Eleanor marry her transfer control of the Whitmore estate into Nathaniel's name, and then through a series of legal arrangements that the letter described with the comfortable specificity of men who had discussed this many times, transfer effective control to Cyrus. In exchange, Nathaniel would receive 1/3 of the annual income from the shipping contracts for 5 years. Her father's brother, her own blood. Eleanor sat in her father's chair and held the letter and let herself feel for the first time all morning the full weight of what had almost happened to her. It was not a small feeling. It lasted approximately 3 minutes. Then she folded the letter, put it back with the others, and stood up. She found Caroline in the upstairs hallway, sitting on the bench beneath the east window, with her hands pressed flat on her knees, and her face showing the particular blankness of someone who has been crying and has decided to stop. She looked up when Eleanor appeared, and something in her expression braced. "Before you say anything," Caroline said, I know what I did. I know there is nothing I can say that—" "Did you know about Cyrus?" Eleanor asked. Caroline blinked. "What?" "Our uncle, Cyrus Whitmore." Eleanor watched her sister's face. "Did you know that Nathaniel was working with him? That this was not simply Nathaniel's scheme, but one that was designed months in advance by our father's own brother?" The blankness on Caroline's face gave way to something genuine shock, real and unperformed, the shock of a person encountering information that reorganized everything they thought they understood. "I know. Eleanor, I didn't." "Cyrus? He never mentioned." "He wouldn't have," Eleanor said. "You were useful to him, Caroline. You were not a partner." She sat down on the bench beside her sister, not close but beside her. The distinction mattered. "Nathaniel gave you enough of the plan to involve you, and not enough to protect you if it failed. You were positioned to take a portion of the blame, and none of the benefit. That was intentional." Caroline's mouth pressed into a thin line. A tear went down her face, and she wiped it away with more force than was strictly necessary. "I thought he was so—" She stopped. "He said he admired my mind. He said he had never met a woman who understood him the way I did." Her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "I wanted so badly to be seen as something other than your younger sister Eleanor. I have spent my entire life being your younger sister." "I know that," Eleanor said. "Do you—" Caroline looked at her directly for the first time. "Do you actually know that? Or do you know it, the way you know things from the outside, from the ledger column, from the accounting of it?" Eleanor was quiet. It was a fair question, and she sat with it because Caroline was right. She did tend to know things from the outside. That was her inheritance from their father as much as the land and the shipping contracts. The ability to see clearly from a distance. The corresponding difficulty of seeing clearly from close up. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that I have not been a very good sister to you in the ways that mattered most to you. I have been reliable. I have been present. I have looked after you in every practical sense." She paused. "But I did not look after your heart, and I think perhaps if I had paid better attention, I might have seen that you were lonely in a way that made you vulnerable to exactly this kind of attention." Caroline's breath caught. She did not speak for a moment. When she did, her voice was unsteady. "That doesn't excuse what I did." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It doesn't. You helped a man try to steal our father's legacy. That was a choice you made, and you will have to live with it, and I will have to live with it, and we will have to figure out together what it means for us going forward." She looked at the window across the hall. The light through it was moving toward afternoon. Now the shadows lengthening. But I am not going to lose my sister and my estate in the same morning. I am not going to let Nathaniel Ashford take two things from me when he has already lost. Caroline stared at her. Why not, Eleanor? I betrayed you. Why would you? Because you are my blood and he is not, Eleanor said plainly. Because Father loved you. Because you were used as much as you used me, even if it was by your own choosing. And because... She stopped. Because I am angry enough at the right people this morning that I don't have much anger left over for you. Caroline put her face in her hands. Eleanor let her cry. She sat on the bench beside her sister and looked at the light moving through the window and thought about the seventh letter and thought about Cyrus Whitmore in his house in Virginia, waiting for news that was not going to come. After a while, she said, I need your help. Caroline looked up. Her face was red and wet. My help? You spent 6 weeks being confided in by Nathaniel Ashford. He told you things he didn't tell me. Not everything I understand that now, but things. Eleanor looked at her steadily. I need to know what else he told you. Names, plans, any arrangement he described that involved the estate or the shipping contracts or anyone connected to this family. You want me to... Caroline absorbed this. You want to use what I know. I want to protect this family, Eleanor said. And right now, you are the person who has the most information about the threat against it. That is an uncomfortable situation that I would rather not be in, but here we are. She held her sister's gaze. Will you help me? Caroline was quiet for a long moment. Then she straightened her spine, which was their father's spine, the same one Eleanor had straightened in the hallway 3 hours ago, and she said, Yes, good. Eleanor stood. Start with everything he said about the shipping contracts. And Caroline, she paused. Don't leave anything out because you think it makes you look badly. I already know it makes you look badly. What I need now is the truth. Yes, Caroline said again, quieter. I understand. Eleanor went downstairs. Judge Hartwell was waiting for her on the east porch, which told her he had either been watching the windows or Thomas had told him she was coming down. She suspected both. I read the seventh letter, she said. He looked at her carefully. And I want to pursue charges against both of them. She stood in the afternoon heat and felt it as a physical thing, the weight of the day pressing down the particular quality of July in South Carolina that made everything feel slightly urgent, slightly overripe, slightly on the verge of becoming something else. Nathaniel Ashford for fraud and misrepresentation, and Cyrus Whitmore for conspiracy to defraud a legal heir. Hartwell nodded slowly. That is going to be a complicated proceeding. Cyrus Whitmore is a man of some standing in Virginia. He will have legal representation. He will dispute the letters. The letters are in his own hand, Eleanor said. Nathaniel responded in writing and signed his name. Yes. Hartwell allowed himself something almost like a smile. They were, I think, very confident that this plan would not be found out, which is itself a kind of evidence. He paused. Are you prepared for what this involves, Miss Whitmore? The formal process, the time, the public nature of a legal dispute of this kind. Judge Hartwell, Eleanor said, I managed an estate of this size alone for 18 months after my father died at the age of 22, while every man in Charleston waited politely for me to fail. I believe I am prepared for a legal dispute. Hartwell looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Your father was a very good man, but I think you may be a better one. Forgive the gender confusion in that sentiment. Forgiven, Eleanor said. Now, tell me what we need to do first. They went inside together. What came next was not dramatic. That was one of the things Eleanor would remember about it later, that the most consequential hours of the afternoon were entirely undramatic. They sat in her father's study, she and Hartwell and Thomas, and they went through the letters one by one, and Hartwell made notes, and Thomas confirmed dates and details from his own memory of the past 8 months. And the sun moved across the sky outside, and the wedding breakfast guests, slowly in the particular way of people who understand they have overstayed but cannot quite bring themselves to leave an interesting situation, began to thin out. By 4 o'clock, most of the guests were gone. By 4:30, Hartwell had the outline of a formal complaint drafted in his notebook and a plan for delivering it to the county court on Monday morning. By 5 o'clock, Eleanor had changed out of her wedding dress carefully with the help of the maid. The dress that had taken 6 weeks to make, and was sitting at her father's desk in her ordinary clothes with a cup of tea. She had let go cold, going over the estate ledgers. Thomas knocked and entered without waiting, which was his custom, and which Eleanor had never corrected because she trusted his judgment about when to knock and when to enter without waiting. "The last of the guests have left," he said. "Good." "Mrs. Beaumont remained until 4. She told me to tell you." He paused. "She said to tell you that she will speak well of you to anyone who asks, and that anyone who speaks poorly of you can speak to her directly." Eleanor looked up from the ledger. "She actually said that—" "Her exact words were somewhat more colorful," Thomas said. "I have summarized." Eleanor set down her pen. "Thomas, sit down." He looked momentarily surprised. She did not often ask him to sit, but he pulled the chair from the corner and sat with the careful posture of a man who had spent 31 years standing. "The 7th letter," she said. "You knew about Cyrus." It was not a question. She had known it since she had read the letter and felt the particular quality of Thomas's earlier silence. Not the silence of a man keeping professional discretion, but the silence of a man keeping something he was not certain he was permitted to share. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Your father knew," he said at last. "He received word approximately 3 months before he died that Cyrus was making inquiries into the estate, asking questions he had no standing to ask through intermediaries." He clasped his hands on his knee. "Edmund believed at the time that it was simply a man's bitterness at being excluded from the will. He chose not to involve you. He said you had enough to manage with learning the business, and that he did not want to worry you without evidence of a specific threat. And then he died," Eleanor said. "And then he died," Thomas agreed quietly. "And I no longer had guidance on what to do with what I knew. And the inquiries from Cyrus had stopped, or appeared to stop, and I told myself—" He stopped. "I told myself the threat had passed. But you kept the letters. Your father kept the letters. I kept them after him." He met her gaze directly. "I am sorry, Miss Whitmore. There is no version of this in which I made the right choice at the right time. I knew things that could have prevented this morning, and I held them for reasons that seemed at the time like reasonable professional judgment, and they were not." Eleanor looked at him, at the face she had known since she was 4 years old, the face of a man who had served her family with complete fidelity for 3 decades, who had made one significant error of omission that had very nearly cost her everything. She thought about what her father had said. "First you understand what happened. Then you decide what to do about it." "Thomas," she said, "I am going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it clearly." He waited. "You have served this family for 31 years, with complete honesty in every matter except the one that mattered most this year. That is a record that most men would trade their best years for." She picked up her pen. "I am not going to dismiss you. I am not going to diminish you. What I am going to do is ask you to make me one promise." "Anything," he said without hesitation. "From this day forward," Eleanor said, "anything you know that concerns this estate, anything at all, you bring to me. Not to protect me from worry, not to wait for better evidence. You bring it to me, and you let me decide what it means." She held his gaze. "I am not my father. I do not need to be protected from difficult information. I need the information." Thomas straightened slightly in the chair. "You have my word, Miss Whitmore." "Good." She returned to the ledger. "Now, there is one more matter, and I need your honest opinion on it." "Of course. Nathaniel Ashford has left Charleston. He did not take a horse from our stable, and he did not, as far as I can determine, have a carriage of his own on the property. He either walked to the road, or someone collected him." She turned a page in the ledger without looking at it. "How far can a man on foot get from this property in 5 hours, and how many roads lead toward Savannah?" Thomas considered this for exactly the time it took him to do a calculation. He had clearly not performed before. On foot, perhaps 8 miles, possibly more if he had the motivation. He paused. "There are 3 roads south from Charleston that connect to routes toward Savannah. The coast road is the fastest but the most visible. The inland route through Beaufort is slower, but considerably less observed. He would take the inland route, Eleanor said. Almost certainly. She made a note in the margin of the ledger. Hartwell is pursuing charges through the county court. That process will take time, and there are no guarantees that Nathaniel will be in South Carolina when the summons is issued. The Savannah connection, the woman he was writing to, suggests he has a destination and possibly resources waiting for him there. Thomas was quiet. What I need to know, Eleanor said, is whether there is anyone in this county with enough connection to the Savannah trade routes to locate a man who is trying not to be found, and whether that person is someone my father would have trusted. Thomas thought about it. James Roper, he said finally. He runs the postal relay between here and Beaufort. Your father used him on 3 occasions when there were irregularities with the coastal contract's men. He needed to verify shipments. He needed to track. Roper is discreet and reliable, and has no love for anyone who disrupts legitimate trade. Can you reach him tonight? I can reach him within 2 hours. Eleanor nodded. Do that. She paused. And Thomas, this stays between us. Not because I don't trust Hartwell, but because the fewer people who know what we're doing, the fewer opportunities there are for Nathaniel to learn that he is being followed. Understood. Thomas rose from the chair and moved toward the door, then stopped. Miss Whitmore, there is one thing I should tell you that I should have told you weeks ago. She looked up. Nathaniel Ashford visited this office on 3 separate occasions when you were not present, Thomas said. The first time I showed him the filing system. The second time he asked to review the shipping contract templates, he said he wanted to understand the family business before the wedding, and I allowed him to look at the templates, not the active contracts. The third time, he paused. The third time, I found him in this room alone. He said he had been looking for you and that the door was open. I had no evidence to contradict that account. Eleanor felt something cold move through her, not fear, but a specific focused anger. What was on the desk when you found him? The ledger from 1814, Thomas said. The year your grandfather transferred the river parcels to your father. The year the land rights had been formally consolidated. The year any challenge to the estate's ownership became substantially more difficult. He was looking for a weakness in the title, Eleanor said. That is my current assessment, yes. She sat with that for a moment. Then, was he able to find one? If he found anything of use in the 1814 ledger, Thomas said carefully. It was not visible to me when I checked it afterward, but I cannot be certain of what he may have noted. Eleanor nodded. Add that to what you give Hartwell on Monday. The 3 unauthorized visits, the access to the filing system, the incident with the ledger. She picked up her pen again. Every detail, even the ones that seem small. Yes, Miss Whitmore. He left. Eleanor sat alone in her father's study for a long time after that. The light was going golden outside. She could hear the household settling around her. The sounds of the day, ending the staff moving through their closing routines. The particular quiet of a house that had contained 200 people 8 hours ago and now contained only its own. She opened the ledger to the 1814 section and went through it line by line. It took her an hour and 40 minutes to find what she was looking for. It was a notation in her grandfather's hand, in the margin of the parcel survey, for the northernmost river tract. Small, easy to miss. The kind of thing that only mattered if you knew what you were looking at. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had grown up reading her father's ledgers, who had learned the business at his elbow before she was tall enough to reach the desk properly, who had managed this estate alone for 18 months without making a single significant error. Eleanor Whitmore knew exactly what she was looking at. The notation indicated a disputed survey line. An old dispute nearly 40 years old between her grandfather and a neighboring family. The dispute had been settled, she knew that from family history, but the settlement had been verbal witnessed by 2 men who were both now dead and had never been formalized in writing, which meant that the boundary of the northernmost river tract, the one that controlled access to the best tobacco routes on the upper river, was not legally documented the way it needed to be. Which meant that if someone wanted to challenge the estate's claim to that parcel, someone who knew property law and had resources and was motivated by, say, the prospect of controlling one of the most profitable trade routes in the Carolina Lowcountry, they had a possible angle of attack. Nathaniel Ashford had found it. He was gone. He was walking south toward Savannah with a failed scheme and a damaged reputation. But he had found the weakness in the Whitmore estate's title before he left. And the question, the urgent pressing question that Eleanor now needed to answer before she could sleep, was whether he had shared what he found with Cyrus Whitmore in Virginia. She closed the ledger and stood up. It was 7 o'clock in the evening. The longest day of her life was not over. She went to the door of the study and called for Thomas. When he appeared, she said, "Before you contact Roper, I need you to write a letter to the county surveyor. Tonight. We need an emergency survey of the northernmost river tract, and we need it documented and witnessed before the end of this week." Thomas looked at her steadily. "He found the margin note." "He found the margin note," Eleanor confirmed. "Which means we need to correct the record before anyone attempts to use it." "Yes, Miss Whitmore." He took out his small notebook, he always had it, and made a note. "Anything else?" Eleanor thought about Cyrus Whitmore in Virginia. She thought about Nathaniel on the inland road toward Savannah. She thought about the letters in the iron box, and the complaint Hartwell was drafting, and the survey note in her grandfather's handwriting, and the wedding dress upstairs that no one had yet moved from the doorframe. She thought about her father in his chair by the window. "Yes," she said. "Find out who Nathaniel Ashford was before he came to Charleston, not who he claimed to be, who he actually was. Every address, every position, every venture, every woman." She met Thomas's gaze. "If he has done this before, and I believe he has, I want to know where, and I want to know to whom. Because if there are other women who were injured by this man, their accounts belong with Hartwell's complaint." Thomas wrote that down too. "Go," she said. He went. Eleanor turned back to the study. She stood in the center of her father's room, the room that smelled like his pipe and his paper, and 30 years of careful decisions, and she pressed her hands flat against the desk and breathed. The day had begun with a wedding that was a trap. It was ending with a woman who understood exactly the shape of what had been set against her, and exactly what she needed to do about it. She was not finished. She was, if anything, just beginning. She pulled the ledger back toward her and opened it to the first page of the 1814 survey records. And she began to read. She did not sleep that night. Not because she was weeping. Not because grief had her pinned to the mattress the way it had in the weeks after her father died. This was different. This was the sleeplessness of a mind that refused to stop working, that kept turning the same facts over and over, the way a river stone turns in moving water, wearing itself smooth against the current. She lay in the dark and went through everything she knew. Nathaniel had been sent to her. That was the foundation of it, the fact beneath all other facts. He had not wandered into the shipping office by chance. He had not fallen in love with her across a crowded room and made his decisions from the heart. He had been recruited by her father's brother, given a target and a plan, and he had executed that plan with the patience and precision of a man who had done something like this before. 8 months. He had spent 8 months in her company, earning her trust, learning her business, memorizing the gaps in her documents, and he had done it so well that she had genuinely felt that she was falling in love. She pressed her hand flat against her chest in the dark and acknowledged, because she believed in honesty, even when it was only herself she was being honest with, that the loss of that feeling was its own particular grief. Not the largest grief she had known, that had been her father's chair by the window empty, but real and sharp and worth naming. Then she set it aside. By 6 in the morning, she was at her father's desk. By 7, Thomas was at the door with coffee and news. James Roper located a man matching Nathaniel Ashford's description at a relay station outside, said, setting the coffee down without being asked. He was traveling under the name William Graves. He purchased a place on a southbound mail coach. He paid in cash. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Destination. The relay ticket was written for Savannah. But Roper spoke with the coach driver privately. The man was persuaded to remember that Ashford or Graves asked specifically about connections from Savannah northward, to Richmond. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. He's going to Cyrus. That is Roper's assessment as well. She set the cup down. Then Hartwell needs to know today, not Monday. If Ashford reaches Cyrus before the formal complaint is filed, Cyrus has time to move. Assets destroy correspondence, build a defense. We lose the advantage of surprise. She was already reaching for the pen. Send for Hartwell this morning. Tell him it is urgent. And Thomas sends someone to the postal relay in Beaufort with a letter for the Savannah postmaster. I want Ashford's movements documented from the moment he arrives in that city. Thomas made his notes. There is one more thing, he said. He did not say it the way he usually said things, which was with professional evenness. He said it with the careful tone of a man delivering information he knows will hit hard. Eleanor looked up. I heard back from a contact in Columbia last night. A man who used to work with your father on the insurance contracts for the fleet. Thomas paused. He recognized Nathaniel Ashford's description immediately. He knew him by a different name. 3 years ago in Columbia, a man using that description married a widow by the name of Harriet Salcombe. She had a small property, a house and 2 lots on the trade road left to her by her first husband. Within 4 months of the marriage, the property was transferred into the husband's name through a standard marital agreement. Within 6 months, the husband had vanished. Mrs. Salcombe spent 2 years attempting to recover her property through the courts and failed because the transfer had been signed voluntarily and legally. The room was very quiet. He has done this before, Eleanor said. Yes. And Harriet Salcombe, is she still living? She is. In Columbia. She remarried a decent man by the contact's account, but she lost the property permanently. She never recovered it. Eleanor stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to Thomas for a moment, looking at the grounds outside the oak trees. The drive, the wide front lawn that was entirely bare now of chairs and carriages, and 200 people who had watched her stop a wedding. She thought about a woman in Columbia who had not stopped it in time, who had signed the papers and lost everything, and spent 2 years fighting for something she never got back. She turned around. Get me her address, she said. Full name, current address, the name of the court that handled the case, and the name of the judge who ruled on it. Everything. She moved back to the desk. If Harriet Salcombe is willing to testify, if she will put her account in a sworn statement to the county court here, then Hartwell's complaint becomes something substantially stronger than a single incident of fraud. Thomas nodded. I'll send a writer to Columbia this afternoon. Send him this morning. She sat down and picked up the pen. We are working against a clock now, Thomas. Every hour that Ashford is on the road south is an hour closer to him reaching Cyrus, and I will not allow them to build a wall I can't get through because I was patient when I should have been fast. Thomas left immediately. Eleanor wrote 4 letters before Hartwell arrived. Hartwell came at 9, moving with his characteristic measured pace that Eleanor had always respected, and this morning found faintly maddening. He sat in the chair across from her desk, reviewed the information about Ashford's route, and read the note Thomas had written summarizing the Columbia account. When he finished, he looked up, and his face had the expression of a man who is revising a calculation upward. A pattern of behavior, he said. That changes the nature of the complaint considerably. That is my assessment, Eleanor said. A single incident of fraud, even with the letters as evidence, can be characterized as a misunderstanding. A man who made poor choices in a specific situation, who was perhaps influenced by his arrangement with Cyrus Whitmore, who might argue partial responsibility. But a man who has done this before systematically to at least one other woman, that is not a misunderstanding. That is a method. You want to establish the pattern in the formal complaint. I want the court to see exactly who Nathaniel Ashford is, Eleanor said. Not who he presented himself to be. Not the respectable Virginia landowner's son with the good manners and the pleasant conversation. The man beneath that who chooses women with property and without enough protection and takes what they have by legal sleight of hand. She paused. And I want Cyrus Whitmore named as the architect. He designed this. He recruited Nathaniel. He provided the target and the intelligence about this family's affairs. Whatever Nathaniel is, Cyrus is worse because he used his own brother's daughter. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. That is going to require direct evidence of Cyrus's involvement. The letters are strong, but his legal representation will argue that they were taken out of context, that the language is ambiguous, that his intent was merely... I know, Eleanor said. which is why I need to go to Virginia." Hartwell stared at her. "Miss Whitmore, not immediately, not alone, but within the week, yes." She held his gaze steadily. "Cyrus Whitmore lives on a property in Fairfax County. He has a household. He has correspondence. He has almost certainly additional documents related to this arrangement that he does not know I am aware of. If I present myself at his door, not as his niece seeking reconciliation, but as the legal heir to the Whitmore estate, accompanied by a man of the law, he will either produce those documents under pressure, or he will refuse to, and either response tells us something." "It tells him that you know," Hartwell said carefully. "It removes the advantage of his not knowing you know." "He already suspects I know," Eleanor said. "Ashford is on his way to Richmond to tell him everything. The advantage is already deteriorating." She pressed her hands flat on the desk. "The question is whether I move before Ashford arrives and take Cyrus by surprise, or whether I wait for the formal process to grind forward at its own pace, while Cyrus destroys his correspondence and builds his defense. I am not willing to wait." Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression of a man who is weighing professional caution against the recognition that the person across from him is right. "I cannot travel to Virginia this week," he said. "I have court obligations that cannot be moved. I know. I'm not asking you to come with me." She paused. "I'm asking you to file the formal complaint against both men today this morning before noon, so that there is a legal record in place before I leave. And I'm asking you to tell me whether there is a man of law in Fairfax County you trust well enough to recommend." Hartwell was quiet for a moment. "Archibald Moore," he said finally. "He trained under the same man I did. He is honest, competent, and he has practiced in Virginia long enough to know the courts there." He paused. "He will want to be paid." "I can pay him," Eleanor said. "Tell me where to find him." Hartwell wrote down an address. He set his pen down and looked at her. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I want to say something to you that is not strictly professional." She waited. "Edmund Whitmore was one of the finest men I knew in 30 years of legal practice," Hartwell said. "He was honest, he was fair, and he was as men of that generation sometimes were not entirely prepared to imagine that the person who would carry his legacy most effectively might be the daughter he worried about protecting." He paused. "I think if he could have seen yesterday morning, he would have stopped worrying." Eleanor held the judge's gaze and felt something move through her chest that was too complicated to name and too real to ignore. "Thank you," she said. "Now please go file that complaint." Hartwell went. She told Caroline at noon. She found her sister in the garden. Not the formal garden at the front of the house, but the kitchen garden at the back where their mother had grown herbs before she died, and where Caroline had always retreated when she needed somewhere that felt like it belonged to her. She was sitting on the low stone wall with her hands in her lap, looking at nothing particular, and she looked up when Eleanor came through the gate with the expression of a woman who had been bracing for a conversation all morning. "I need to tell you what's happening," Eleanor said. She sat down on the wall beside her sister closer than she had sat on the bench the day before. "All of it. Because you're part of this family, and because some of what comes next may affect you, and because I think you've had enough of being kept in the dark by people who thought they were managing you." Something shifted in Caroline's face. Something that was mostly relief and partly grief. "Tell me," Eleanor told her. "All of it: Roper's report, the Columbia account, Hartwell's complaint, the survey note in the 1814 ledger, the plan to go to Virginia." She told it plainly without softening the parts that reflected badly on how close they had all come to losing everything. She told it the way her father had told her difficult things, when he did straight through no decoration, with the implicit respect of believing the other person could handle the truth. Caroline listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Harriet Salcombe," she said. "He did this to another woman." "Yes." "And she lost her property." "Yes." Caroline pressed her lips together. "What did he tell me about Columbia?" she said half to herself. "He mentioned once that he had spent 2 years there before moving to Virginia. He said it was for business. He said he had invested in a trade concern that didn't work out." She paused. "He was very casual about it, the way people are casual about things they've rehearsed." Do you remember anything else he said about that time? Any name? Any detail? Caroline thought. He said he had lived with a family there. A widow, he said. He said she was kind, but impractical. Her voice had gone quiet and careful, the voice of someone listening to a memory with new ears. He said she was the kind of woman who needed someone to manage things for her. Eleanor felt the anger come clean and specific and entirely controlled. He described his victim to you, she said. He described what he did to her, and he presented it as a kindness. Yes. Caroline's voice was flat. He did. They sat on the stone wall for a moment, both of them carrying what that meant. I want to give a statement to Hartwell, Caroline said then. Everything he told me, every conversation about the estate, about the contracts, about the plan, all of it. I know it will. She stopped. I know it will be public. I know what people will think of me. Some of them will think less of you, Eleanor said honestly. Some of them already do, and some of them will understand that you were used by a practiced deceiver, and they will think what Mrs. Beaumont thinks, which is that you were foolish and young, and that is a recoverable condition. She paused. But that is a consequence you will have to manage in your own time. What matters right now is whether you're willing to do it. I'm willing, Caroline said. She said it without hesitation, which Eleanor noted. Eleanor, I know I cannot undo what I did, but I want to be useful. I want to do something that actually helps, not just something that makes me feel less terrible. Eleanor looked at her sister for a long moment. Then she said, All right, come inside. Thomas will write down what you remember, and we will have it formalized before the end of the day. They went in together. The afternoon was a series of necessary tasks, completed at speed, each one feeding the next. Caroline gave her statement to Thomas, who wrote it out in full, read it back, corrected 2 details at Caroline's instruction, and produced a clean copy that Caroline signed. It was 17 pages. When Thomas brought it to Eleanor, she read it through once quickly and found 3 pieces of information she hadn't known. The first was a name, a man in Richmond, a lawyer named Prescott, who Nathaniel had mentioned in passing as someone who handled arrangements. The second was a date Nathaniel had told Caroline in a moment of apparent confidence, 6 weeks before the wedding, that the transfer of the estate documents was planned to happen within 30 days of the ceremony. The third was a detail so specific it made Eleanor's breath stop for a moment. Nathaniel had told Caroline that Cyrus Whitmore had been to Charleston twice in the past year, both times, without Eleanor's knowledge, both times meeting with Nathaniel at the Planters Hotel on Church Street. Cyrus had been here, in this city, twice, planning the dismantling of his own brother's estate from a hotel room 12 blocks from the Whitmore house. Eleanor sent for Hartwell immediately. He arrived within the hour, read Caroline's statement, and when he got to the Planters Hotel detail, his expression did something she had never seen it do in 20 years of knowing him. It went very still, in the specific way of a man who has just been handed the piece of evidence that changes everything. The hotel will have a register, he said. Yes, Eleanor said. If Cyrus Whitmore's name appears in that register on the dates Caroline has specified, it places him in Charleston in direct communication with Ashford during the planning period. It corroborates the letters. It eliminates any argument that the letters were theoretical or misunderstood. She held his gaze. Can you get the hotel register? I can send a deputy with a formal request this afternoon. Hartwell was already on his feet. If the proprietor is cooperative, and he has no particular reason not to be, we could have confirmation before nightfall. Go. Hartwell took Caroline's statement and went. Eleanor stood alone in the study for exactly 45 seconds. Then she sat down and wrote a letter to Archibald Moore in Fairfax County, Virginia. She introduced herself, described the situation with the precision of a woman who had grown up reading contracts, and asked whether he was available to accompany her on a visit to her uncle's property at the earliest possible date. She sealed it and gave it to the fastest writer Thomas had, with instructions to leave immediately. Then she opened the estate ledger and went back to work. The confirmation from the Planters Hotel came at 6 in the evening. Thomas brought it in a short note from Hartwell, the hotel register entries copied out in Hartwell's precise hand. Cyrus Whitmore, October 14, 1816. March 3, 1817. October was 2 weeks after Nathaniel had first appeared at the shipping office. March was 2 months before the wedding date was set. Eleanor held the paper and felt something crystallize in her chest. Not triumph was premature, but clarity. The clarity of seeing the full shape of a thing that had been partially obscured, all its edges finally defined. Nathaniel had come to her in October, fresh from a meeting with Cyrus at a hotel 12 blocks away. He had sat across from her and asked intelligent questions about tidal schedules, and she had thought he was not pretending to know less than he did, and she had liked him for that. She had liked him for a quality that was itself a performance designed to make her like it. In March, Cyrus had come back to confirm the plan was on track. The wedding date had been announced in February. Cyrus had come to Charleston to check his investment, review the progress, confirm with his hired man that the trap was set correctly. She set the paper down. She thought about her father, who had known his brother was dangerous, who had kept letters that he hoped she would never need, who had died before he could finish protecting her. She thought, "I am finishing it for you, Father. I am finishing all of it." There was a knock at the study door. She looked up. Yes. Thomas opened it. Beside him stood a woman Eleanor had never seen before, middle-aged, composed with the careful posture of someone who has learned the hard way to take up exactly as much space as she needs and no more. She was wearing a traveling dress dusty at the hem. She had clearly come a long way. "Miss Whitmore," Thomas said. "This is Mrs. Harriet Salcombe Moore. She arrived an hour ago from Columbia." He paused. "She says she received word that you might need her testimony." Eleanor rose from her chair. "Harriet Salcombe. Harriet Moore." Now she corrected. She had remarried. Met Eleanor's gaze with the particular directness of a woman who has been through something that stripped away every pretense and left only what was essential. She was perhaps 40. Her eyes were steady and careful. "I got the letter this morning," she said. "I didn't wait for a formal invitation." Her voice had the clipped precision of someone who had said difficult things to difficult rooms before. "I have been waiting 3 years for someone to tell me there was another victim. That what happened to me happened to someone else as well." She paused. "I have my original court documents with me. I have 3 letters he wrote to me during the courtship that I kept because something in me knew to keep them. And I have a very clear memory of everything, because some things you do not have the mercy to forget." Eleanor crossed the room and held out her hand. Harriet Salcombe took it without hesitation. "Mrs. Moore," Eleanor said, "I am very glad you came. Please sit down. I want to hear everything." They sat together in Edmund Whitmore's study. The woman who had almost lost everything, and the woman who had already lost everything, and rebuilt herself on the other side of it, and Harriet talked for 2 hours without stopping. Thomas sat in the corner and wrote without looking up. Eleanor listened with complete attention, asking questions only when a detail needed clarifying, the way her father had taught her to listen to a witness, not to confirm what you already know, but to learn what you don't. By the time Harriet finished, the room was dark, and Thomas had filled 12 pages. Eleanor sat back in her chair and looked across the desk at this woman who had traveled from Columbia on a day's notice, because someone had finally told her the man who had ruined her was being held to account. "Will you stay?" Eleanor asked. "In Charleston, I mean, through the legal proceedings. We may need your sworn testimony before the county court, and I cannot ask you to make this journey twice." "I will stay as long as necessary," Harriet said. "My husband understands. He has always understood." A pause. "He wanted to come with me. I told him this was something I needed to do myself." "I understand that," Eleanor said. "I thought you might." Harriet looked at her steadily. "Miss Whitmore, what you did yesterday, I heard about it from Roper's contact in Beaufort, who apparently hears everything that happens in 3 counties. What you did standing up in front of 200 people." She stopped, started again. "I didn't have anyone in my corner when it happened to me. I had no Thomas Bennett, no Judge Hartwell, no father's letters in an iron box. I had no one who knew what was in the documents, and no one who believed me when I said something was wrong." Her voice was even, but only just. "I want you to know that what you did matters beyond yourself. It matters for every woman who didn't have what you had. Eleanor held Harriet's gaze, and for a moment, the study felt very full of her father's presence, and her grandfather's ledgers, and 31 years of Thomas Bennett's careful loyalty, and the weight of what had almost happened and what had not. "Then let's make sure it counts for something," Eleanor said. She looked at Thomas. "Get Mrs. Moore settled in the East guest room, and in the morning—" She picked up the pen. "In the morning, we have work to do." Thomas nodded. He closed his notebook. "Miss Whitmore," he said before he left. A reply came an hour ago from Fairfax County, from a Mr. Archibald Moore. Eleanor looked up sharply. "And?" "He is available," Thomas said. "He can meet you in Richmond by the end of the week." A pause. "He also says he knows Cyrus Whitmore by reputation, and that the reputation is not good." The not good kind of reputation, Eleanor thought, was almost always the most useful kind to know about in advance. "Confirm the meeting," she said, "and book the earliest northbound coach." "You're going to Virginia," Thomas said. It was not a question. "I'm going to Virginia," she confirmed. "And this time, I will be the one who arrives without warning." She bent back over the desk. Outside, July had moved into its late evening, the heat finally breaking the first breath of something cooler. Coming off the water, the long Charleston dusk settling over the estate like a hand laid gently over a wound. Eleanor did not feel the cooling air because she was not thinking about the air. She was thinking about Cyrus Whitmore in his house in Fairfax County, and about the mail coach heading south with a man named William Graves, who believed he had escaped, and about the 11 letters in the iron box, and about Harriet Moore in the East guest room with her court documents and her 12 pages of testimony, and 3 years of waiting for someone to finally listen. She thought they built their plan over 7 months and believed they had thought of everything. They had not thought of Eleanor. That she decided was going to be the most expensive mistake either of them had ever made. She turned to a fresh page and kept writing. The northbound coach left Charleston at 5 in the morning. Eleanor had slept 3 hours. She knew because she had listened to the clock in the hallway mark every quarter hour from midnight until Thomas knocked on her door at 4, and she had counted the intervals with the same mechanical attention she gave to everything that could be measured. 3 hours was enough. She had managed a shipping estate on less. She carried 1 bag. Inside it, the 11 letters from the iron box, copied twice over by Thomas the previous evening, with the originals wrapped separately in oilcloth. Hartwell's formal complaint filed the previous afternoon and bearing the county court seal. Caroline's 17-page statement. Harriet Moore's court documents from Columbia, which Harriet had pressed into her hands the night before, with both of hers holding on for a moment longer than the gesture required, the way people hold on to things that cost them something to give away. And Archibald Moore's address in Fairfax County, written in Thomas's precise hand on a folded square of paper that Eleanor had read and memorized and kept anyway. Thomas stood on the drive when the coach came. He did not make a speech. He was not the kind of man who made speeches. He handed her bag up, checked the coach door latch with his thumb, the way he always checked things, and said, "The surveyor will have his initial findings on the river tract by Friday. I'll send word." "Good." She settled into the seat. "Thomas, if anything changes, any communication from Ashford or from Virginia, send a rider. Don't wait for my return." "Yes, Miss Whitmore." She looked at him through the window as the coach began to move. He stood on the drive and watched it go, and his expression was the expression of a man who had made one significant error in 31 years of good service, and had decided with the particular quiet ferocity of people who take their commitments seriously that the rest of his life would be the correction of it. She looked forward. The road north was long, and she used every hour of it. She had brought the copy of the letters, and she read them again, not for the facts which she had memorized, but for the tone. For the particular way Nathaniel and Cyrus had written to each other, the comfortable shorthand of 2 men deep in a shared enterprise, the places where the language became casual and unguarded in a way that formal correspondence never did. She was looking for the thing beneath the plan. The thing that had made both men believe this was not only feasible, but appropriate. That a woman's inheritance was a resource to be mined rather than a life to be lived. She found it in the fourth letter, which she had not read as carefully the first time. Cyrus had... Edmund always was too sentimental about the girl. He treated her like a son, and now she believes she is one. It won't hold up. Women were not built to manage what he built, and anyone who looks at the estate in 5 years' time will see it failing and understand that we were right to intervene. She folded the letter and put it back with the others. She thought about the estate she had managed for 18 months without a single significant error. She thought about the river track survey, the shipping contracts, the ledgers she could read in her sleep, the tobacco growers who sent their business to the Whitmore fleet, because she had kept her father's word to every single one of them without exception. She thought Cyrus Whitmore has never met me properly. He has only imagined me. That is going to be his final mistake. The coach arrived in Richmond late on the second day. Archibald Moore was waiting at the coaching inn. He was perhaps 50, with the build of a man who had spent decades sitting behind a desk, and the eyes of one who had spent those same decades paying close attention to everything happening in the room. He rose when she came in, removed his hat, and said, "Miss Whitmore, Arch Moore. I've been in correspondence with James Hartwell for 20 years, and if he says a matter is urgent, I believe him." "Thank you for coming quickly," Eleanor said. "I reviewed your letter twice on the ride over." He had already ordered coffee, which she was grateful for. He poured her a cup without asking whether she wanted one, which she appreciated. "I know Cyrus Whitmore by reputation, as I indicated. I've had 2 cases in the past 5 years that involved men who did business with him. He is..." Moore paused, choosing the word carefully. "He is a man who operates in the spaces that the law leaves open. He is meticulous about staying on the right side of a line, which means he knows exactly where the line is and how close he can stand to it without stepping over. He stepped over this time," Eleanor said. "Yes, these letters." He had read them, she realized. She had sent copies with her confirmation letter. These letters put him squarely over it. The question is whether he has had time to prepare his position. He looked at her steadily. "Ashford arrived in Richmond 2 days ago." Eleanor went still. "You know that?" "I made some inquiries when your confirmation arrived. A man named William Graves, matching the description you provided, was seen at the Franklin Hotel. He left the following morning, heading, I believe, toward Fairfax." Moore paused. "He arrived at Cyrus Whitmore's property yesterday." Yesterday. 1 day ahead of her. She had moved as fast as she could move, and he had still gotten there first. She picked up the coffee, set it down. "How long does a man like Cyrus need to destroy correspondence and construct a defense? If he is as careful as I believe him to be," Moore said, "he already has a version of events prepared. He has had that version prepared, I suspect, as a contingency from the beginning. Men like Cyrus Whitmore do not run operations of this kind without an exit story." "Then we go tomorrow morning," Eleanor said. "Not with an appointment, without warning." Moore looked at her. "That is unconventional." "He knows we're coming," Eleanor said. "Ashford told him. The advantage of surprise is already gone. What we have instead is the advantage of arriving before he has had time to move anything. Anything: physical documents, assets, witnesses, he might want to relocate. If we give him another day, he uses it." She held Moore's gaze. "You told me he operates in spaces the law leaves open. I want to close those spaces before he finds another one." Moore was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You sound like your father from what Hartwell tells me." "I hope not entirely," Eleanor said. "My father was better than me at patience. I am better than him at speed." She reached for the coffee again. "Tell me everything you know about Cyrus Whitmore's property and household. Every detail. I want to understand exactly what we are walking into." Moore talked for 2 hours. Eleanor listened and did not take her eyes off his face once. They arrived at the Whitmore property in Fairfax County at 10 in the morning. It was a substantial house. She could see that much from the drive, and she allowed herself to see it because it was useful information rather than aesthetic detail. Substantial meant resources. Resources meant lawyers and connections, and the ability to wait out a legal process that a smaller man could not afford. She filed that away and kept moving. Moore knocked. A servant answered, looked at them with the carefully neutral expression of a household that had been told to expect visitors and told nothing else, and went to find the master. Cyrus Whitmore kept them waiting 12 minutes. Eleanor counted. 12 minutes was long enough to destroy a small number of documents or to compose yourself. She suspected he had done the latter because when he appeared, he was entirely composed, a man in his late 50s with her father's jaw and none of her father's warmth, dressed precisely and moving with the deliberate ease of someone who had decided on his performance well in advance. He looked at Eleanor for a moment with the expression she recognized from men who had underestimated her before the rapid recalibration, the adjustment of expectations, upward, the settling of a new strategy. "Eleanor," he said, as if they had seen each other last week, as if she were paying a social call. "Uncle Cyrus," she said with the same tone, "I believe you know why I'm here." "I know what I've been told," he said. "I understand there was an incident at your wedding." "There was," Eleanor said. "The incident was that I stopped a fraud before it could be completed." She met his eyes. "You already know the details. Nathaniel Ashford told you when he arrived yesterday." Something moved across Cyrus's face. Not guilt. Men like this did not produce guilt easily. Something more like recalculation, the slight adjustment of a chess player who has seen his opponent's move and is already looking 3 moves ahead. "I don't know what Ashford may have told you." "He told me nothing," Eleanor said. "He didn't need to. You told me yourself." She reached into her bag and produced the 7th letter, the original, not the copy, the one in Cyrus's own handwriting. She held it out to him. He looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. His composure held. She would give him that. It held the way a dam holds when the water is pressing against it visibly with effort, with the particular stillness of something that is working very hard to appear unstressed. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Moore privately," Cyrus said. "No," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "Whatever you have to say," she said, "you say it in front of me. I am the injured party. I am also the person who holds the formal complaint, the documented evidence, the corroborating account of a second victim in Colombia, and the hotel register from the planters in Charleston, showing that you were in my city twice during the planning period." She paused. "I am also Edmund Whitmore's daughter, and I have been managing his estate for 18 months without anyone's assistance, and I am not a woman you get to speak around as though I am not present." Cyrus was very quiet. Moore beside her said nothing. He had his notebook out. "I'd like to sit down," Cyrus said finally. "Certainly," Eleanor said. "Shall we go inside?" They went inside. What happened in the next hour was not a confrontation in any dramatic sense. It was not shouting or weeping or the theatrical collapse of a man revealed. It was in many ways worse than that. It was the grinding, detailed, specific business of a man slowly understanding that every exit he had prepared was blocked. Cyrus began with denial. He did not know Nathaniel well. He had met him socially. The letters were misinterpreted. The language says. Moore read aloud in the measured voice of a man who had read letters like this in courts for 30 years. "Once the marriage is completed and the transfer executed, the Whitmore girl will have no legal standing to challenge the management of the estate, and your position as the estate's true administrator will be unassailable." He looked up. The phrase Whitmore girl and the specific legal terminology regarding standing and administration are not the language of social acquaintance, Mr. Whitmore. Cyrus moved to partial admission. He had perhaps advised Nathaniel. He had been concerned about the estate, genuinely concerned. He had watched his brother build something remarkable, and he had feared that. "You feared that a woman would manage it," Eleanor said. "You said so. In the 4th letter." She produced it. "Women were not built to manage what he built." Your words. Your handwriting. Cyrus looked at the letter. His jaw tightened. Then he said something she had not expected. He said, "Your father stole that estate from me." The room went still. Moore's pen stopped moving. Eleanor held Cyrus's gaze and did not speak. "Edmund and I built the first trading contracts together," Cyrus said. His voice had changed. The composure was still there, but it had cracked open slightly, and what was coming through the crack was old and genuine, a grievance that had been living in him for so long, it had grown its own shape. I was the one who established the Beaumont connection. I was the one who negotiated the first river routes. Edmund took my work, took my investment, and when our father died, he maneuvered the inheritance to cut me out. Everything that estate is every acre, every contract, every ship was built on my labor as much as his. And so your solution, Eleanor said carefully, was to use my grief and my trust and my wedding day to take it back. My solution, Cyrus said, and his voice had gone to something very quiet, was to recover what was taken from me. Through my daughter, Eleanor said. Through Edmund's daughter, who did nothing to you. Cyrus looked at her. You are his instrument, he said. Everything he left you was meant to perpetuate his victory over me. I do not expect you to understand that. I understand it perfectly, Eleanor said. And I am telling you that whatever Edmund did or did not do, 30 years ago, whatever injury you believe you suffered, the method you chose to address, it was fraud and conspiracy and the deliberate targeting of a woman who had no part in your quarrel. She leaned forward slightly. You used my father's death. You waited until he was in the ground, and then you hired a man to take from his grieving daughter what you claimed your brother took from you. That is not justice, Cyrus. That is cruelty wearing the costume of a legitimate grievance. Cyrus said nothing. If you believed you had a legal claim to a share of your father's original estate, Eleanor continued, you had legal avenues. You contested Edmund's will and you lost. And I am sorry if that outcome was unjust, but the appropriate response to a lost legal case is not to commit another crime. She sat back. The formal complaint has been filed in Charleston. My attorney is prepared to pursue it. We have the letters the hotel register the Columbia case and the testimony of a witness who will speak to your arrangement with Nathaniel Ashford from direct knowledge. She paused. What we do not yet have is your version of events given voluntarily, which is the only thing that remains in your control at this moment. The silence was very long. Moore did not move. His pen was still waiting. Cyrus looked at his hands. He looked at the letter in Eleanor's hand, his own writing, his own words, the evidence of his own plan laid out in the specific way that men who are meticulous lay out their plans and then have them turned against them. What do you want? He said. His voice was flat now. The performance was gone. 3 things, Eleanor said. First, a full written account of the arrangement between yourself and Nathaniel Ashford. Every detail from the initial approach to the day of the wedding. Signed and witnessed today. She held up one finger. Second, the surrender of any documents in your possession relating to the Whitmore Estate Survey's contract copies, any legal analysis you may have commissioned regarding the disputed river tract boundary. 2 fingers. Third, a sworn statement that you will make no further claim legal or otherwise against the Whitmore estate or its heir, and that you will not assist or facilitate any person who attempts to do so in the future. Cyrus's expression had gone entirely still. And in exchange, Eleanor said, I will ask Hartwell to note your cooperation in the formal complaint, which will not make the charges disappear, but will make a meaningful difference in how the court weighs your culpability. She paused. I cannot offer you more than that, and I will not pretend I can. What you did was serious. There are consequences. But there is a difference between a man who cooperates and tells the truth, and a man who compounds his crime by fighting every step of the process, and that difference shows up in the outcome. Moore looked sideways at her. She could feel him making a professional assessment. Later, she thought he would probably tell her she had offered more than she needed to. She already knew that. She had made the calculation deliberately. She was not here to destroy Cyrus Whitmore. She was here to stop him. Those were different things, and the difference mattered to her, the same way it had mattered to her father, who had once said, sitting at this very desk on a late afternoon when she was 16 and furious about something she could no longer remember, Eleanor. You can win a fight completely and still lose the kind of person you are while you're winning it. Know which one matters more. She wanted to win the fight. She was not willing to lose herself doing it. Cyrus looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I want my own attorney present. Send for him, Eleanor said. We'll wait. The attorney arrived at noon. His name was Graves, not the same Graves that Nathaniel had used as a traveling alias, just an unhappy coincidence that Eleanor noted and filed away. He was a careful older man who read the letters without expression, spoke privately with Cyrus for 20 minutes, and then came out and said, "My client is prepared to provide the written account and surrender the documents. The sworn statement regarding future claims requires a modification to the language in the third paragraph." Moore and Graves negotiated the language for 45 minutes. Eleanor sat in Cyrus's parlor and drank water, and did not allow herself to feel anything prematurely. When the language was agreed upon, Cyrus signed. He signed with the pen, held very straight, and the face of a man who is doing something that costs him everything he thought he had left. And Eleanor watched him do it without satisfaction, and without mercy, and without anything particularly complicated, just the clean, exact recognition that this was the right outcome, and it was done. Moore witnessed the signature. The attorney witnessed the signature. Eleanor countersigned the cooperation agreement on behalf of the formal complaint. Cyrus handed over a leather folder. Inside it were 11 documents, surveyor's notes, legal analyses, 2 letters from the attorney Prescott in Richmond that Eleanor had not known about, and that would prove useful, and a hand-drawn map of the Whitmore River tract, with 2 lines marked in different ink. The current recorded boundary, and the disputed line that the 1814 notation had left vulnerable. He had done his research. He had planned this carefully. And all of that careful planning was now in Eleanor's bag, which she closed and held on her lap, and she stood up. "Cyrus," she said. He looked at her. "I don't know what Edmund did or didn't do to you 30 years ago," she said. "I know who he was to me, and I know who I believe him to have been, but I was not there, and I cannot speak to the original injury. If there was one, if you were genuinely wronged, I am sorry for it." She met his eyes. "But Edmund is dead. And what you did to me. And I want you to understand that I am not a continuation of him. I am my own person, and the estate is not a symbol of anything except the work of a woman who has been managing it alone and intends to keep doing so." Cyrus said nothing. "Goodbye," she said. She walked out. Moore fell into step beside her on the drive. They were 20 yards from the house before he spoke. "The Prescott letters," he said quietly. "You saw them?" "Yes." "Prescott has been facilitating arrangements of this kind for other clients in Virginia. There are names in those letters, other men, other targets, other women." Eleanor kept walking. "I know. That's a larger matter than your case. I know that too." She reached the road. "I'm going to forward those letters to Hartwell and let him determine which courts have jurisdiction. That is not my fight to lead. I have enough of my own." She paused. "But I will send copies to every woman named in them, if I can locate them with a letter explaining what I know. And I will tell them that if they need a name to start with, they can write to Eleanor Whitmore in Charleston, and I will tell them everything I know." Moore looked at her for a moment. "Hartwell said you were formidable. He was being modest." Eleanor almost smiled. "I am my father's daughter," she said. "On the days when that is a good thing, it is a very good thing." She looked at the road north where a rider was approaching at speed, a courier's horse moving with the urgency of a message that couldn't wait. The rider pulled up. "Miss Whitmore?" "Yes." He handed her a letter. Thomas's handwriting on the outside. She broke the seal and read it quickly, her eyes moving down the page with the speed of a woman who had trained herself to extract essential information fast. The county surveyor had completed the initial assessment of the river tract. The disputed boundary notation from 1814 had been examined. The surveyor's finding, based on the original land grant from 1791 and corroborating records from 2 neighboring property surveys, was that the boundary as the Whitmore family had used it and recorded it was correct. The verbal settlement her grandfather had reached with the neighboring family had been in fact legally sufficient under the standards of 1779, the year the dispute had originated because of a specific provision in the colonial land grant charter that had never been revoked. The disputed line was not disputed anymore. The weakness in the title that Nathaniel had found that Cyrus had mapped that the entire secondary strategy of the plan had been built on did not exist. Eleanor folded the letter. She stood on the road outside her uncle's house in Fairfax County, Virginia, holding a surveyor's finding that sealed the Whitmore estate's title permanently, with a leather folder full of her enemy's surrendered documents under her arm, and a formal complaint moving through the Charleston County Court, and she took a long, slow breath of Virginia summer air. Moore was watching her. "Good news," he said. "The estate title is confirmed," she said. "The disputed boundary was never actually disputed. It was a notation my grandfather made as a reminder to himself, not a legal vulnerability, just a record of an old conversation. The survey confirms the Whitmore boundary has always been exactly what we said it was." Moore absorbed this. So even if the rest had succeeded, the secondary plan would have failed anyway, Eleanor said. They found a weakness that wasn't one. She looked at the letter for a moment. Which means they built 6 months of planning on a foundation that never existed. Which means my father built better than they knew. She put the letter in her bag. "Mr. Moore," she said, "I believe you have earned your fee several times over today. Thank you." She held out her hand. He shook it, and his grip was firm and respectful. The handshake of a man who is shaking hands with someone he has decided to take entirely seriously. "The pleasure was mine, Miss Whitmore, genuinely." A pause. "What will you do now?" She looked at the road south. "Go home," she said. It was the simplest answer and the truest one. She had left Charleston 2 days ago with a list of things to accomplish, and she had accomplished every item on the list and several things that hadn't been on it. The complaint was filed. The documents were surrendered. The title was confirmed. Nathaniel Ashford was somewhere on a road between Richmond and Savannah with a failed scheme and a criminal complaint attached to his name. Cyrus Whitmore had signed away his capacity to threaten the estate and would spend the coming months learning the difference between a legal dispute he could manage and the specific legal dispute of a woman who had done her preparation. She had one more stop. She told the rider to wait and went back to the door of the Whitmore house and knocked. The servant answered. "Tell my uncle," Eleanor said, "that I would like him to know one thing before I leave." The servant went, came back. Cyrus appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who had already used up everything he had and was not certain what face to wear now. "My father loved you," Eleanor said. "I don't know what happened between you, and I may never know. But the letters he kept, the ones in the iron box, some of them were from you. Old letters, from when you were young. He kept them." She held his gaze. "I don't know what that means to you. Maybe it means nothing. But I thought you should know." Cyrus was very still. "He kept them," he said. It was barely audible. "Yes," Eleanor said. She did not wait for his response. She turned and walked back to where Moore and the rider were waiting, and she did not look back at the house, and she did not allow herself to feel right now the complicated grief of that, the grief of 2 brothers and 30 years, and an old wound that had festered into something neither of them had intended, because she was still working, and she would feel it later privately, the way she felt everything that was too large for the middle of a task. The road south was long, and she had a leather folder full of surrendered documents and a letter from Thomas that confirmed the estate was whole. She got into the southbound coach. She was going home. The coach reached Charleston on a Thursday afternoon 4 days after Eleanor had left. She knew she was home before she saw the house. She knew it from the particular quality of the air coming off the harbor, the salt and the river mud, and the specific warmth of a Carolina summer that was different from Virginia's warmth in ways she could not have articulated, but felt immediately in her chest. She had grown up breathing this air. Her father had built his life in it. The Whitmore estate had been rooted in this particular soil for 2 generations, and no amount of planning by men who saw it only as an asset had been able to pull it up. Thomas was waiting on the drive. Of course he was. He did not ask how it went. He looked at her face and at the leather folder under her arm, and at the way she was carrying herself straight, unhurried with the specific composure of someone who has finished a hard thing, and he said, "Welcome home, Miss Whitmore," and took her bag. "The surveyor's final report," she said, moving toward the house. "Completed and filed with the county clerk yesterday morning. The boundary is confirmed and documented. We have 3 certified copies." He fell into step beside her. "Judge Hartwell's office sent word this morning. The formal complaint has been accepted by the court. Summonses have been issued for both Ashford and Cyrus Whitmore. A pause. And Mrs. Moore is still here. She said she would wait until you returned. Eleanor stopped walking. She stayed the whole time. She said she had nowhere more important to be. Thomas allowed himself something close to a smile, which on his face was a subtle thing. She has also, in your absence, reorganized the East Parlor filing system, identified 2 errors in the 1815 tobacco contract ledger, and had 3 conversations with Caroline that appear to have been productive. Eleanor started walking again. Good Lord. She is a very capable woman. Yes, Eleanor said. She is. She found Harriet Moore in the study, which surprised her. Not that Harriet had made herself at home in the most important room in the house, but that the sight of her there at the desk that had been her father's and was now hers felt right rather than wrong. Harriet was reading a document and had a cup of tea at her elbow, and she looked up when Eleanor came in with the alert, steady expression Eleanor had come to associate with her in the 3 days they had known each other. "You're back," Harriet said. "I'm back." Eleanor sat in the chair across from her own desk. She was aware of how strange that was and did not mind it. He signed. Harriet set the document down. Something moved across her face, a complicated thing. The expression of a person receiving news they have needed for a long time and are not quite certain yet how to hold. Cyrus Whitmore. Full written account. Surrendered documents. Sworn statement of no further claims. Eleanor opened the leather folder and set the signed agreement on the desk between them. It will be submitted to Hartwell this afternoon. Harriet looked at the signature. She did not touch it. She just looked at it for a moment, and Eleanor let her look because some things needed to be seen plainly before they could be believed. "And Ashford," Harriet said. "The summons has been issued. We don't know where he is precisely, but the postal networks between here and Savannah have been alerted. He is traveling as William Graves. He will surface somewhere, and when he does, there will be a legal process waiting for him." Eleanor paused. "I also found letters in Cyrus's documents that suggest a lawyer in Richmond named Prescott has been facilitating similar arrangements for other clients. I've forwarded those to Hartwell. That investigation is larger than mine to lead, but I've started it." Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You did all of this in 4 days." "I had good preparation," Eleanor said, "and good help." Harriet looked at her steadily. "Miss Whitmore, what you've done, the complaint, Cyrus's statement, the Prescott letters, this is going to matter for other women. Women I don't know, women in situations I can only imagine. Men like Ashford don't stop at 1 or 2. They stop when someone makes stopping necessary." She paused. "You made it necessary." Eleanor felt the weight of that land quietly on her shoulders. Not a burden, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt more like the weight of a thing that was real and worth carrying. "I hope so," she said. "I genuinely hope so." They sat together for a moment in comfortable silence. The particular silence of 2 women who have been through something difficult and come out the other side of it still standing. Then Harriet said, "Your sister would like to speak with you. She has been waiting, I think, since before I reorganized the filing system." Eleanor stood. "How is she?" "Honest," Harriet said, which is probably the best thing she could be right now. Caroline was in the kitchen garden again, the same place Eleanor had found her 3 days ago, on the same low stone wall in a different dress, with the same expression of a woman bracing herself. She looked up when Eleanor came through the gate, and this time she did not try to speak first. She waited. Eleanor sat down beside her, closer than before. "I went to Virginia," Eleanor said. "Cyrus signed a full cooperation agreement. The estate is protected. The title is confirmed. The formal complaint is moving through the court." Caroline nodded. She had known most of this from Thomas's reports, but she listened as though hearing it for the first time, because what Eleanor was telling her was not just information. It was the shape of what had happened, and what it cost, and what it meant, and that was different from a summary. "The Columbia account," Eleanor continued. "Harriet Moore's testimony, your statement, Cyrus's written account, the hotel register, the letters." She looked at her sister. "It is a thorough case, Caroline. It is thorough in part because of what you told me." Caroline pressed her lips together. "I want to say something to you," Eleanor said, "and I want you to hear it completely before you respond." "All right. What you did was a serious betrayal. It was not—" Eleanor paused, choosing the words with care. "It was not a small mistake or a moment of weakness. You made choices over a period of weeks that could have cost me everything Father built. You made them deliberately, even if you made them from a place of pain." She held her sister's gaze. "I need you to understand that I know that I am not pretending it was smaller than it was in order to forgive you more easily. I am forgiving you with my eyes open to exactly what it was." Caroline's breath came in unevenly. "Eleanor, I'm not finished." Eleanor kept her voice steady. "I have been thinking on the road back from Virginia about what I said to you in the East Parlor. That I had not been a good sister to you in the ways that mattered most. I meant that. I still mean it." She paused. "I cannot be the sister I wasn't for the last 21 years. I cannot go back and give you the seeing that I didn't give you when you needed it. What I can do is choose from this point to look at you more carefully, to consider what you need before you need to take it from somewhere dangerous." She looked at her sister's face, the familiar face, the jaw that was their father's jaw. "I am asking you to do the same for me. To tell me when something is wrong, rather than let it fester into a decision you'll regret. Can we agree to that?" Caroline was crying quietly, not dramatically. Just the silent tears of someone who has been bracing for judgment and received something they didn't know how to hold. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and nodded. "Yes," she said when she could. "Yes, Eleanor, we can agree to that." Eleanor put her arm around her sister's shoulders. They sat on the stone wall in the kitchen garden for a long time, neither of them speaking the late afternoon, moving around them the way time moves around people who are for the moment exactly where they need to be. The formal court proceedings began 6 weeks later. Nathaniel Ashford was located in Savannah, not at any woman's house as they had expected, but at a waterfront boarding house, having apparently run out of both money and options considerably faster than he had anticipated. He was brought back to Charleston under legal escort, with the particular dignity of a man who has discovered that his exit route was considerably shorter than his plan required. Eleanor did not attend the first 2 hearings. She had the estate to run, and she ran it the summer tobacco contracts, the river routes, the fleet, maintenance, 3 disputes with neighboring landowners that she resolved without going to court, because her father had taught her that the best legal victory was the one that didn't require a judge. She appeared in person only for the hearing at which Cyrus Whitmore's cooperation agreement was entered into the record, because she wanted to be in the room when that happened, and because she wanted Nathaniel Ashford to look at her across that room and understand the full extent of what he had misjudged. He did look at her. He had the face of a man who was still even now performing, still trying to find the angle, still looking for the expression that would help him. She watched him searching for it, and found to her own surprise that she felt very little. Not triumph, not satisfaction, exactly something quieter. The recognition that this was the correct outcome moving forward at its correct pace, and that her part in making it happen was already behind her. Harriet Moore gave her testimony at the 3rd hearing. She stood in front of the court and spoke clearly and without drama in the same direct voice she had used in Edmund Whitmore's study that first night, the voice of a woman who had said difficult things to difficult rooms before. She spoke for 40 minutes. When she sat down, the room was quiet in the particular way that rooms are quiet when something true and costly has been said, and everyone present understands its weight. Eleanor, sitting in this gallery, reached over and put her hand briefly over Harriet's. Harriet pressed it once firmly and let go. The verdict, when it came, was guilty on all primary counts of fraud and conspiracy against Nathaniel Ashford. Cyrus Whitmore, given his full cooperation, received a lesser, finding a formal censure, a financial penalty equivalent to 3 years' income from his own estate, and the permanent sworn record of his cooperation, which meant that any future legal maneuver against the Whitmore estate would be immediately compromised by his prior admission. His attorney called this a favorable outcome. Eleanor called it appropriate, which was different. Nathaniel Ashford lost his property rights in South Carolina. He was formally barred from entering into any property-related legal agreement in the state for 15 years. The Prescott investigation in Virginia, which Hartwell had passed to a Richmond attorney, produced 3 additional cases of a similar nature, 2 of which had sufficient evidence to pursue. Eleanor wrote letters to both women. One wrote back immediately. The other wrote back 2 months later, and her letter was 4 pages long, and Eleanor read every word of it twice. She kept every letter she received in the iron box. Her father's iron box, with her father's key on her watch chain, now held something different than it had, not just the deeds and contracts and surveys that documented what the Whitmore family owned, but the record of what Eleanor had done to keep it. She thought her father would have appreciated that. The estate changed in the year that followed, and Eleanor was the reason it changed. The northernmost river tract, its title now permanently confirmed, became the basis for an expanded contract with 4 tobacco growers who had previously worked with a competing fleet. She negotiated those contracts herself, sitting across the desk from men who had watched her stop a wedding and had adjusted their assessment of her accordingly, and she got better terms than her father had gotten, which she noted in the ledger without comment. She hired 2 additional people for the shipping office, one who had worked the Beaumont routes and knew the coastal patterns better than anyone Eleanor had met, and one who had grown up on the river and could read the water the way some people read text. She trained them both herself, the way her father had trained her, with patience and specificity, and the expectation that they would eventually know the work better than she did. She started a school. That was Caroline's idea, which Eleanor would acknowledge freely because it was a good idea, and because acknowledging good ideas from the people who had them was something her father had done and she intended to continue. There were 12 children in the first year. Children from the households of the estate workers. Children from the neighboring farms. 2 children whose mothers had written to Eleanor after hearing through the particular efficient network of women who pay attention about what had happened at the wedding and what had happened afterward. The school met 3 days a week in the East Parlor, and Caroline taught reading and arithmetic, and Eleanor occasionally appeared to teach the older students basic accounting, which she considered a more useful skill than most of what was taught in the formal academies. Harriet Moore went back to Columbia in September to her husband and her recovered life. She and Eleanor wrote to each other regularly, not long letters, not the detailed correspondence of women who had nothing else to do, but the efficient, warm, specific letters of 2 busy people who have decided that the connection between them is worth the time. Eleanor's letters to Harriet were the most honest she wrote to anyone, which told her something about what that friendship was and what she needed it to be. Thomas Bennet remained. Obviously. He had served the Whitmore family for 31 years, and he intended Eleanor suspected to serve it until he physically could not, at which point he would probably find a way to continue anyway. He had kept his promise. Every detail, no matter how small, came to Eleanor's desk. And he had, in the month since the wedding, demonstrated a particular alertness to any inquiry about the estate that came from outside the family's established relationships, which Eleanor had not asked him to do, and which she valued more than she said. She told him once. She told him clearly. He nodded once precisely and went back to work. That was enough. Margaret Beaumont came to call in October. She came in the afternoon without advance notice, which was her custom, and which Eleanor had stopped being surprised by. She sat in the East Parlor, which was now also a schoolroom 3 days a week, and which still bore the slight rearrangement of furniture that resulted from that, and accepted a cup of coffee, and looked around the room with the expression of a woman cataloging change. "The school is your sister's work," she said. It was not a question. "Her idea," Eleanor confirmed. "She teaches it." "I know. I spoke with 3 of the mothers." Margaret looked at her. "Caroline has more in her than anyone gave her credit for, including, I think, herself." "Including me," Eleanor said honestly. "I didn't see it clearly enough." "You see it now." "Yes." Margaret drank her coffee, set it down. "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer me directly because I'm 62 years old and I don't have time for anything else." Eleanor waited. "Are you content?" Margaret said. "Not happy. I'm not asking whether the estate is running well or whether the court case resolved satisfactorily. I'm asking whether you, Eleanor Whitmore, are content with the life you are building." Eleanor considered the question seriously, which was the only way Margaret deserved to have it considered. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Not because everything is resolved, it isn't, and it won't be. There are still days when I think about what I believed Nathaniel was and feel the loss of that. Not of him, but of what I thought was real." She paused. "But the estate is mine, and it is whole, and I know exactly how it works and what it needs. My sister is becoming someone I can actually know. The school is doing something real for children who needed it. And I am—" She stopped. "I am doing the work I was trained to do by the man who knew me best, and I am doing it well. That is not a small thing." Margaret looked at her steadily. "No," she said. "It is not." They sat for a while in the comfortable silence of women who understand each other without requiring it to be explained. Then Margaret said with the particular mildness of a person landing something significant, "There is a man named Daniel Reeves who has taken over the Hargrove Cotton Brokerage. He has been in Charleston for 3 months. He is honest, he is not looking for a property to acquire, and he has asked after you twice that I know of." Eleanor looked at her. "I am not suggesting anything," Margaret said with perfect innocence. "I am simply telling you what I observe." "You are absolutely suggesting something. I am 62 years old. I suggest things." She picked up her coffee. "I'm not saying anything should happen. I'm saying that you are 24 years old, and Edmund Whitmore did not raise you to manage an estate alone forever. He raised you to manage it well. Those are different things." She met Eleanor's gaze. "He also raised you to love something, if you found the right thing to love. He loved your mother, and he loved what they built together, and I think he would want that for you, not because you need it, but because it is one of the things that makes a life, and you deserve a full life, Eleanor." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. She thought about her father in his chair by the window. About the morning she had stood in the hallway outside his study and heard the voice of the man she thought she loved describe her as efficient. She thought about how that had felt, not the anger which had been clean and useful, but the thing beneath the anger, the grief of having been wrong about something she had counted on. She thought about what it would mean to trust again. The specific work of it, the choosing to believe in someone, when you knew from experience exactly what the cost of being wrong was. She thought, "I am not afraid of the cost. I am afraid of misjudging again." And then she thought, "That is not a reason not to live. That is a reason to pay attention." "I will think about it," she told Margaret. Margaret smiled. "That's all I ask." The first frost came early that year. Not the killing frost, just the first suggestion of it, the morning when you step outside, and the air has changed, and you know, without having to be told that summer is finished, and what comes next will require different things from you. Eleanor was at her father's desk when she felt it, the particular quality of the cold morning air coming through the window. She always left cracked the smell of the river and the changed season, and something else. The sense of being exactly in the right place at the right time, doing exactly what she was meant to do. She had the estate ledger open. She had 3 letters to write before noon, one of them to Harriet, and one to the Richmond attorney handling the Prescott case, and one to a tobacco grower upriver who had been slow with the season's accounting and who needed a polite but firm reminder of his contract terms. She had on the corner of the desk an unopened letter from Archibald Moore in Virginia, which she would read after the 3 letters were written, because she had learned from her father that you finished the work in front of you before you picked up the next thing. Thomas knocked. She said, "Come in," without looking up. "The surveyor has sent a revised map," he said, incorporating the confirmed boundary. "I've had it framed. Would you like to see where I've placed it?" She looked up. "Where did you put it?" "The east wall," he said. "Beside your grandfather's original land grant. I thought—" He paused. "I thought the boundary your grandfather established and the boundary you confirmed belonged beside each other." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "That was the right instinct, Thomas," she said. He nodded. He was about to go when she said, "Thomas." He stopped. "My father trusted you for 31 years, she said. "I intend to trust you for at least that long, possibly longer, since I intend to live a good while yet." Thomas Bennett, who had served the Whitmore family through 2 generations and one extraordinary July morning. And all the months that followed, it allowed himself briefly, and without compromising his professional bearing, something that was unmistakably a smile. "It would be my honor, Miss Whitmore," he said, "as it has always been." He went. Eleanor turned back to the ledger. She picked up her pen. Outside, the first cold morning of autumn was beginning to warm. The way mornings did, slowly, with the particular patience of a season that understood it had time. The harbor was out there, and the fleet and the river routes that had been her father's and were now hers. The school was in the east parlor 3 days a week, with children learning to read in the room where a conspiracy had been planned and hadn't worked. Caroline was somewhere in the house, probably already at her preparations. Probably already thinking about what the children needed today, which was the kind of person she was becoming, a person who thought about what others needed, which was a good thing to become. The iron box was in its drawer. The key was on Eleanor's watch chain. The estate was whole. She began to write. This was what Edmund Whitmore had left his daughter, not just the land and the ships and the contracts and the river routes. Not just the iron box and its carefully kept secrets. Not just the watch chain and the key and the long view from the window where he had died peacefully in his chair. He had left her the knowledge of how to do hard things clearly and with her eyes open. He had left her the capacity to lose something and survive it and keep working. He had left her in 31 years of Thomas Bennett and a kitchen garden and a school that hadn't existed yet and a sister who was learning to be known. He had left her in all of it. The understanding that a life was not a thing you protected by holding still. A life was a thing you built every day with the tools you had and the people you trusted and the work that was in front of you. Eleanor Whitmore was 24 years old. She had kept her father's name on her father's land. She had done it with clear eyes and a steady hand, and the absolute refusal to be made small by men who had decided in advance that she was. And every morning from this one forward, she would sit at this desk and open this ledger and do the work. Not because she had no other choice, but because this was the choice she had made with full knowledge of what it cost and what it gave. And she intended to honor it. True inheritance was not wealth. It was the wisdom to protect what truly mattered. And Eleanor Whitmore knew down to her bones exactly what that was.